the Anglo-Turkish Society. I'm pretty ill-placed to be presiding this evening, since I'm yesterday's man in two senses, both ex-chairman of the Institute and of the Society itself. But in the absence, inevitable absence of the present chairman, I have to do. But I am quite well qualified to introduce Professor Stephen Mitchell. I think we've known each other for 25 years, roughly. At least, I'm afraid. Stephen is undoubtedly the most qualified historian, archaeologist in this country when it comes to Asia Minor. He has spent, I think, 14 years on a project in southwest Turkey directing surveys of the Burdur, Isparta and Antalya vilayets. It was, I think, from that time that his wonderful two-volume work on Asia Minor, which is called, if you don't know it, Anatolia, Land, Men and Gods in Asia Minor, published by Oxford University Press. And if you haven't got it already, you need to go to a well-known bookshop tomorrow and acquire it. It is unrivaled. Several other works, Cremona in Pisidia. Cremna, sorry.
Yes.
And
Antioch.
And Antioch in Pisidia, amongst other things, and a history of the late Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And now, most recently, a book which he has written in collaboration with David French, the ex-director of the Institute, on the Latin and Greek inscriptions in Ankara. Stephen was most recently Professor, I think the Leverhulme Professor of Hellenistic Culture at Exeter University, and is now emeritus in that role. Was Professor Lecturer at University of Wales, Swansea, for many years, and is the backbone of the British Institute at Ankara, having been its honorary secretary on 2 occasions, beyond the call of duty, I would have thought, but anyhow, knows more about it than anybody else, and is going to talk to us about it. Professor Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Can you hear me at the back if I speak at this level, or shall I use the microphone? Microphone, I think we'll do that then. So is that better, not too loud or resonant? Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to give this talk. I haven't got a script, but I do have a PowerPoint to sort of keep me on track talking about the Institute. As Timothy says, I've been very closely associated with the British Institute at Ankara for a very long time, indeed since the first time that I went to Turkey. Perhaps the second time that I went to Turkey ever was in 1967 as an undergraduate student of Oxford, and I visited the Institute on that occasion because a very slightly older friend of mine held a fellowship there. I went to the Institute, and I was only told many, many years later that the then director, whose name will come up shortly in the talk, had heard that 2 young men from Oxford had turned up, and on no account was he to see them during their visit. And we didn't have much time. We went off from Ankara to Boğazköy, and the following day, which was a very long day's excursion on a bus from Ankara in those days, and back the same evening, and then the following morning we were heading down south to Silifke. So I didn't see the then director, but my own serious engagement with the Institute began in 1970, when I was the first year as a postgraduate student and beginning my own doctoral work on Roman Asia Minor, Roman Anatolia, which has been sort of my academic stamping ground ever since. But I'm not today going to give you a sort of academic talk about my own work, or in any real detail about the archaeological historical discoveries of the Institute over the last 60 years of its existence, although I will mention some of the personalities and some of the highlights. But rather, I saw the objective, I don't know what people are expecting here, was simply to give you an idea of what the British Institute has been and is. And some of you in the audience know the Institute almost as well as I do, or perhaps better. And so for many, this will not be news. Others may know very little or relatively little about the Institute. I don't have a scripted talk. If you need to interrupt me because I'm not being clear, then please don't hesitate to do so. If you want me to elaborate on something where I'm being too brief, again, raise a hand or ask a question, and I'll see what I can do without sort of transgressing the boundaries. I don't know what convention says how long we should run till. It's 20 to 7 now, so if we aim for 7:30 to end the talk, would be about right. Okay, actually it occurs to me I could put this microphone on this stand. And is that still good? And then I don't have to carry it around with me all the time, all right? Good. Is that fine for acoustics? Good. Okay, British Institute at Ankara, İngiliz Archaeology Enstitüsü. Certain contradiction, the one phrase does not translate the other, and you will see the reason for that in the course of my talk, because the Institute in its present state has emerged to be something rather different from the Archaeological Institute that it was when it was founded in 1947, 1948. However, whatever you call it, it remains a research institute. That is to say, it's an organization that organizes, enables, to some modest degree, finances research in Turkey. And therefore the focus that sort of pulls all its work together is various forms of research, although it's also expected and required indeed of research institutes in 21st century Britain that they also do serious outreach, that they communicate their research both to academics and to a broader public, and that's something that the Institute has always taken seriously, but now perhaps takes even more seriously than it used to in the past. We have an office in London, which is in the basement of the British Academy, and I don't have a photograph of that, although two of the a former and a present London manager are sitting in the audience here today, and can certainly elaborate should further on that side of things should that become necessary. But the focal point of the physical point of our activities in Turkey is a building in Kabaklıdere in southern Ankara, which you can see on that slide there. A building housing offices, a library, study collections, and modest facilities for holding seminars, not by any means as grand as this lecture room here. The Institute was founded, depends which way you look at it, whether you think it's 1947 or 1948. We've chosen 1948 as our anniversary date. The founder was Professor John Garstang, who had a very, very lengthy career as a Middle Eastern archaeologist, but in UK was based in the University of Liverpool, where he was Professor of Archaeology for many years. I got to know Garstang's name as a graduate student because right at the very beginning of the 20th century, in 1906, 7, 8, 9, he'd travelled in Turkey and written one or two things which were still valuable to read. In his retirement especially, and he was well retired by 1947, he became predominantly interested in the Hittites. And he was the driving force behind the foundation of the Institute. And his personal objective for it was to create a small research institute which could support British research essentially into the Hittites. And the Hittites have been a preoccupation of not only Garstang, who himself died, I think, in 1956, but his, I don't think he was directly his pupil, but certainly someone who was mentored by him was Oliver Gurney, who had a career as a Oriental linguist in the University of Oxford, and was a major figure in the British Institute for very nearly 50 years, editing its journal Anatolian Studies, as well as being a central member of its council. Not a field archaeologist, but a philologist, a scholar of Hittite language, but who wrote an excellent Penguin book, which is still pretty much the standard work on the Hittites. And he ended up, in the latter years of his career, was president of the Institute, and our current president is an equally distinguished Hittite scholar, Professor David Hawkins, who is at the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. And so Hittite studies, I won't be saying anything more about Hittite studies, but I mention it now just in connection with these three very, very important figures who have carried the flag for British Hittite studies for 70, 80 years now. And if it hadn't been for Garstang's interest in that, there would be no British Institute at Ankara, because he was the founder. The Institute was founded as an academic membership organisation, a club. I don't know how many members there were in those first years, in the late 40s, early 50s, perhaps between 80 and 100 members in all, including most of the prominent British scholars who had a sort of professional interest in Turkey, and those who had an interest in the archaeology of the Near East, because from the start it was envisaged as an archaeological institute, an institute concerned with research into the antiquities of Turkey in the broadest sense. And that has remained the traditional focus of what the Institute does, and you can see that if you just look at the list of the directors of the Institute since its foundation. We've had 6 directors. All of them, in one way or another, have been archaeologists. Seton Lloyd, Michael Goff, David French, taking the story up to 1993. Roger Matthews, Hugh Elton, Lutgarde van der Put, up to the present day. I think 1993 is quite a important dividing line, a sort of a punctuation mark in the history of the Institute. Archaeology for most people means excavation, having a dig, an excavation, and using excavation as the means to find out about the material past of the country. It's a quite striking fact that all the first three directors directed excavations in Turkey in various places. I'll mention them briefly, but none of the latter three directors, the last three, has directed an excavation, but have rather devoted their energies to other forms of archaeological work, in particular archaeological survey, and I'll say something more about the difference between that, so that at least as far as the directors have been concerned, excavation was really the sort of the main focus, the main objective of what they did for the first how many years, 25 years, or no, more than that, 40 years of the Institute's life. But in the last 15 to 20, the emphasis has changed significantly. You can find out all the detail, which I'm not going to tell you now, about the Institute's activities, with emphasis on the archaeological discoveries that it's made. If you, by looking at what three of its directors have had to say about it in print, Seton Lloyd gave a lecture which I remember hearing and was subsequently published in Anatolian Studies back in 1974, in which he surveyed the first 25 years of the Institute's activities. Roger Matthews, in 1998, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, edited a splendid volume which is still in print, and I can recommend it very strongly as a very good introduction, not just to British work in Turkey, but a very sort of lively and illustrated survey of the archaeology of Turkey itself, called Ancient Anatolia, 50 Years' Work by the British Institute in 1998. And then Lutgarde of Vanderput, our present director, brought the story more or less up to date a couple of years after she was in post in 2008. So there's a sort of good academic bibliography for you to fill your time with and follow up. And I do in particular recommend the book Ancient Anatolia, which I think is a terrific monument to what the Institute achieved in those first 50 years. Excavation, digging. I'm sometimes mistaken for an archaeologist, and I don't think I myself identify myself as an archaeologist. I think of myself more as a historian. I work with written documents as much as, if not more than, with the material record. But archaeologists are inevitably the British Institute at Ankara, and there are comparable institutes. There's a British Institute of Persian Studies just still got a foothold in Tehran. In Baghdad there was an institute which also just about has a foothold. You can see that modern politics has a big impact on the history of these organizations. Athens and Rome have also large and well-known establishments, and they're all strongly associated with archaeology and excavation in these areas. I think in 100 years' time, when we look back on this particular episode of relationships between Europe and the Mediterranean, the Near East, they will come to look like very much institutions of a period when, as it were, Northern Europe was rediscovering, discovering the civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean, and sending its experts out to discover those regions. and they were doing it through the means of archaeology, of excavation, especially finding splendid objects, great cultures and civilizations. And I think that'll be in the sort of cultural history of the old world. That period between about 1850 and 2000 will be seen as a period when all that was happening. Of course, things are all changing these days as the relationships between Europe and Turkey, or Europe and the Near East, are changing, as the countries that were sort of providing the sites and the information are now becoming developed countries with elaborate institutions, scientific resources of their own, and they can pursue their own forms of investigation into their past, and so the relationship is different. For most people, and certainly for most people in Turkey, archaeology and excavation are synonyms. That is not true anymore in the UK. If you go as a student to an archaeology department and study archaeology in London or Exeter or Sheffield or wherever, although you will certainly spend a summer or two doing some practical digging and field work, almost certainly 2/3, 3/4 of the work you do won't anymore really be direct, hands-on related to excavations. It's become a science of discovering about the past of these countries through their material record, especially in prehistory, but not exclusively in prehistory before written records existed. And so the definition of what archaeology is in Britain, in Germany, in France, is now much wider than simply being concerned with excavation. That's not the case, of course, in the popular mind, where I think archaeology is inevitably associated closely with an excavation, the finds, the discoveries from an excavation, digging things up, discovering new things. And that, I think, partly sort of fits into my narrative that the first 40 years of the British work focused on excavations and discoveries in excavations. Latterly, the emphasis has shifted to a more perhaps broad scientific approach to archaeology. However, excavations are important. They give a sort of emblematic feel. Archaeologists are always very proud, thrilled, as is the general public, at big new finds, important sites, civilizations being discovered that weren't known about before. From a range of sites that have been dug by the British archaeologists, I've just listed here a handful. Seton Lloyd, the first director, focused most of his field work on a site called Beyce Sultan in sort of western Turkey. Sort of, I suppose, Denizli is probably the nearest big city to Beyce Sultan. A Bronze Age palace with very fine palace-style architecture, although not any spectacular finds in terms of sort of small finds. I'm hard put to think of an emblematic small object that I could put on the screen and say, that's Beyce Sultan. But that was typical. Seton Lloyd was an architect as well as an archaeologist. He liked big buildings. He was a very wonderful drawing hand, and it was entirely appropriate that Beyce Sultan should have been the site that he invested his time. This is the Bronze Age. This is 3000 to 1500 BC, roughly. The first period in Anatolian history when pretty large-scale sites, fairly densely scattered across the countryside, emerge. His work, though, was overshadowed by that of his assistant director, James Mellart, who was both the most controversial and the most charismatic archaeologist that the British Institute has produced, who his name is associated with two sites in particular, Hacilar, near Lake Burdur, very early site, about 5000 BC, and that did produce these objects that just imprinted themselves on people's minds. Pottery, anthropomorphic pottery, pottery with very sophisticated early painted decoration, which were almost modish. In fact, they were quickly spawned, a whole mass of fakes came on the market after Mellart had actually found the real thing, because they were so appealing and attractive. And so Hacilar was a site that out of the blue sort of suddenly overshadowed really Hasidin Lloyd's work at Beja Sultan. And then it was followed up even more spectacularly by the discovery and early excavation of Çatalhöyük, which was even earlier, 7000 BC or thereabouts, at the sort of dawn of settlement in Turkey. And it was a site that for the scholarly world refocused attention on the origins of agriculture, the first major human settlements, but it was also connected with the finds that he made there of the shrines, the sculptures, the fantastic obsidian, the leopards, all these things you can still see in the Ankara Museum. And so Çatal very quickly became more than an archaeological site. It became a sort of a symbol, an emblem of, and was taken over by the Turks themselves. I mean, psychologically, as this gave them an origin. This gave them one of the earliest civilizations with this wonderful site. So Çatal was just about the acme of British Institute of Archaeology. They could not have found a more sort of spectacular site. It all ended in tears, of course, at the time. I mean, it wasn't always all roses, but Çatal has been immensely important from all sorts of points of view to the British Institute since that discovery and those early excavations of James Mellart. And then I've listed the three sites dug by David French in his long tenure as director, 1968 to 1993, none of which will be known to non-specialists, in the sense that none of them is a site which sort of imprinted itself on the public imagination, but all of them illustrated, I suppose, what you might call a more avant-garde style of archaeology than had been practiced by the previous two during the late 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. Çatalhöyük has come right back onto the agenda. James Mellart, as many of you know, died earlier this year at the age of 86. As I said, the Çatal excavation had ended in tears, in a good deal of scandal and controversy that surrounded James Mellart in the last year or last season or two of his excavation, 1963.
Is that all right, Stephen?
That's fine, yes. 1963, 1964. And which ended in the Turkish authorities deciding to refuse to continue his permit to work at Çatalhöyük, and indeed for a very brief period not allowing him back into the country at all. although happily that sort of ban was restored. But it meant that James Mellott, after a spectacular early career in the 1950s and early 1960s, was unable to continue fieldwork himself through the later 1960s and the latter half of his career, during which he was a lecturer in the Institute of Archaeology here in London. And so for almost 3 decades, Çatal remained unexcavated, or not further excavated, until Ian Hodder, then at the University of Cambridge and now at Stanford in California, one of the leading theoretical archaeologists of his generation in Britain, perhaps I don't know Ian Hodder well enough to know whether it was surprising or not, but if you look at Ian Hodder's early work, it's very, very abstract and I think theoretical archaeological work. He was right in the avant-garde of his science. Took the decision to put his knowledge into practice and brought a proposal which was accepted by the Institute to reopen the excavation at Çatalhöyük, and that is now approaching 20 years of work that Ian Hodder and his team will have done there. The results that they are finding, or the way they publish it, are spectacularly different from what James Mellott did with the site, although one should no doubt see them as complementary. And that photograph, of course, shows the two directors together. That must have been taken around about the mid-1990s. And I think it's a rather optimistic story that as it were, this famous site, which has so much to offer, has been looked at from quite different perspectives by quite different scholars. As I said, in the last 3 directors have tended to focus their work not on excavation but on survey. That is to say, travelling around areas of Turkey looking for remains of antiquity, recording them systematically but without excavating. Now, survey has, in my view, been the great strong point of the British Institute, right back to its earliest days. James Mellott and David French and several others during the 1950s and 1960s. Then a generation of scholars more recently have really made survey the main object of their research. Again, I just picked out a few highlights. Roman roads, David French, quite extraordinary, a lifetime of fieldwork in which he has rediscovered the entire Roman network of Anatolia, which, when you think how big it is, and you know that one person in a Land Rover can go round and find all those old roads from whatever clues are there, is a quite extraordinary achievement of a wonderful piece of field work. 3 of us have been very much connected with the survey of southwest Turkey and classical sites. Myself, as Timothy mentioned, I spent 14 seasons working in the Burdur, Antalya, Sparta region. Jim Coulton, who worked in northern Lycia, and our current director, Lutgarde van der Put, who took over the permit that I had to work in Pisidia and has carried it forward and developed the work in different ways. And Roger Matthews, director in the later 1990s, did absolutely pioneering work in northern Turkey, in the Ankara vilayet, north of Ankara. I can't possibly illustrate all this, so I just thought, just to give you a sort of a flavour, I think the most remarkable of all this survey work is David French's Roman roads survey, which has, as I say, occupied him for 30 years. And just on the Institute's website now, you'll get the reference, 2 major volumes of his work have just been published online to complement work which is already in print from him. These are rather dry-looking maps, but on the left you can probably make out the outline of Western Turkey, the Western vilayets, and a road system. That is the earliest Roman road system in Turkey, created between 129 and 126 BC. The very first time that Roman governors had direct authority within the country. Roman influence was already there earlier, but this was the first Roman province in the country. And as you see, the road network is very limited. It's just some long-distance roads linking Side in the far south-east on that map, and Pergamon, and then north of Pergamon, the Dardanelles, Lampsacus, in the northwest, with a triangle of roads: Ephesus, Sardis, Smyrna, Laodicea, Denizli, not actually marked on that, not labelled on that map. But then, 150 years, 200 years later, Rome's direct rule extended all the way to the Euphrates, but the Roman map on the right-hand side of your screen is just a snapshot of the Roman roads that were built or repaired or maintained, as is attested by milestone inscriptions, in the time of the Emperor Hadrian in central Turkey, in what was called the province of Galatia, with you can see in the north this concentration of roads around Ankara, which was then the most important city of central Turkey, and then these are the roads around Konya, in the southern part of the central Anatolian plateau. All that really discovered or rediscovered and documented in enormous detail in French's survey, which I think is a monument to, as it were, late 20th century exploration of ancient Anatolia. That's a generic shot of the sorts of things that archaeologists do, and not the Turkey, southern Turkey especially, is blessed, or was until recently, and there's a lot of damage now just to ancient sites, but it's not many parts of the of the old world where you get buildings standing as they were in antiquity to several stories and still intact. That's one of the buildings at a site that our current director, Lutgarde van der Put, is surveying at Pednilissos. When I first went to Pednilissos, there was hardly a road there. Now it's beginning to be touched by tourism in the hinterland of Antalya. And various shots of excavations and discoveries of a more showing the more conventional view, as it were, of archaeology. In the 2000s, so bringing the story more or less up to date, that list of field projects and the green dots on the map represent the geographical range of archaeological activity that the Institute was either financing or supporting logistically around about 2006, 2007. I don't think I need to go on, but you can see a dozen or so projects that were not all initiated by the British Institute, but the Institute is regarded by the Ministry of Culture as holding, as it were, the responsible brief for all British work that goes on in Turkey. So we have to, as it were, be reassured that these are all responsible, well-financed operations, and we provide the logistical infrastructure support that they may need to carry out their work. Enough of archaeology, though. I want to move on now just briefly to mention the other things that the Institute is doing or has done recently, and the areas into which it's now developing. I've explained that the Institute was founded as an academic club, if you like, in the late 1940s. During the 1950s, it was, shall we say, adopted by the leading institution for the academic support of the humanities in the UK, that is the British Academy. And since the 1950s, the British Academy has given money not just to the British Institute at Ankara, but to the other sister institutes in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds to support their work, to the point that now, and in fact for at least since the 1960s, the major part of our income no longer comes from membership subscriptions, but from a grant from the British Academy, because the Institute is seen as carrying the flag for British research, science, or in the humanities in Turkey, in our case. The British Academy were also anxious that we redefined our brief geographically so that it extended to include the Black Sea area outside the geographical boundaries of Turkey, so that the east, west and northern shores of the Black Sea, as well as the southern, and also that we widen our academic spectrum of activities. That they didn't want to invest money in an institute that just did archaeology and thereby excluded lots of other excellent academic projects in different subjects and disciplines. And so the very strong trend in the last 6 or 7 years, increasingly strong in the last 2 or 3, has been to expect the Institute to support projects in a wide disciplinary range. And one of the first things we did with the appointment of not our current assistant director, but his predecessor, was to launch a first initiative to study the Ottoman world, which of course was chosen not just because it represented a period of Turkish history which we hadn't concentrated on very much previously, but also because the Ottoman Empire extends far beyond the boundaries of Turkey itself, and thus represented this sort of broadening geographical scope of the Institute's activities. And the frontiers of the Ottoman world were chosen as the theme for a big conference which was duly published around about 2009, and the Institute has directly supported two projects that focus on the frontiers of the Ottoman world. An excavation at Ankara in the present Ukraine, where the red star is on the top left there, and our former assistant director's own research included study of Turks and Georgians both in present-day Georgia and in eastern Turkey. So Ottoman frontiers became a theme for the Institute about 5 years ago, and remain very much on our agenda. And we built up the library to be able to support serious research in that area. Another developing theme reflected modern preoccupations with climate change and climate history. So teams of natural scientists, geographers, environmental geographers have been working under the Institute's auspices and in collaboration with various Turkish universities, especially Ankara University itself, at, again, the red dots give you an idea of where our environmental scientists have been doing their fieldwork, collecting data to document the history of climate change. So climate history has become another new theme. And then to bring the story right up to date, in the last 12 months, we have decided, following, as it were, trends in British academic research, to identify a group of broad themes relating to Turkey, which can then be explored at different periods. So the purpose of this is to open up what we do, to invite applications from especially younger scholars who have an interest in working in Turkey under one of these headings. So habitat and settlement in prehistoric, historical, and environmental perspective, that's really very much designed for the archaeologists, but work on migration, minorities, and regional identities is something that could be done in a period in contemporary Turkey, very much so, but could also be applied to the study of ancient Turkey. Cultural heritage is a very big preoccupation in modern Turkey. There's a huge need for better understanding, more complex understanding of Turkey's cultural heritage, which is now very much of interest to Turkish public and academics. And we've got two big initiatives in that area. Looking at contemporary Turkey, which is also something that we are interested in pursuing, we want to play to our strengths and look at questions of religion and politics in a historical perspective, because of course the Institute has a historical perspective, and that's the area that it can supply, as it were, a sort of distinctive approach. And climate and its historical impact we've retained as one of our themes. So we're trying to build the work about the Institute now around these 5 research areas. The Institute is well resourced, a large library. It's from many points of view the best academic library in Ankara, which is now building beyond its very strong archaeological ancient world base to include Ottoman and Islamic collections and contemporary Turkey collections. It has collections of squeezes, I'll explain that on the next slide, of pottery collected from ancient sites and catalogued and accessible for scholars to consult. These are very unglamorous looking sherds, I should have to say. They're not pots that are going to be in any museum cabinet, but they are the bread and butter of the academic archaeologist. And environmental data which has been collected, seeds, bones, wood collections, herbarium. And all these are housed in the institutes. I said I'd explain what a squeeze is. I'll indulge myself in doing that because it's my particular speciality. This is an inscription. This is a Latin inscription in Ankara, built by the entrance to the Ibadullah Jami down by the Anafatullah markets, if you know that part of Ankara. The mosque was built in the just at the beginning of the 17th century. A Latin gravestone. In order to get an exact copy of that inscription, you put a piece of paper, blotting paper effectively, on the stone. You wet it with water, you tap it down with a hairbrush or a clothes brush, let it dry, and then you have an exact replica of the inscription produced in a very short time at very low cost, and you can then keep that in your reference collection and consult it whenever you need to. So that's what a squeeze is, and the Institute has a major collection of about 8,000 of these things, which are a collection of the documentary history of especially classical period in Turkey. We give out money to support research students and research scholars under those headings. These change sometimes from year to year, but that's sort of roughly the current cluster of grants that we give. So if you yourselves, or if you know people who might be interested in applying for money, then they should simply go to our website and find out what the prospects are that they'll get support from us. We publish currently 3 types of publication: our annual journal, Anatolian Studies, an annual magazine, of which there's a sample copy over on the side, Anatolian Archaeology, just been rechristened as Heritage Turkey to represent the breadth of what we now do, and a series of monographs. I've left out the 2009 monographs, one by Roger Matthews, former director, one by Stuart Blaylock, publishing Tilehu, one of the excavations from the 1980s. In fact, from earlier this year, I have a copy, I've just been given a copy of it. There's an even more up-to-date monograph publication from one of the surveys by Jim Coulton. So we try to keep abreast with major scientific publications of our work. The Institute is a membership organisation. Several of you here in the room I know are members, but if you're not, I would ask you, beseech you, to think of joining us for the modest cost of £40 a year, or 20 if you're a student. Life membership, particularly good value. We require people who use the institute in Ankara to be members. If you're going to stay at the hostel, if you're going to use the library and so on, you do have to be a member to do so. But you get the annual journal and the magazine. You take part in what can attend lectures and conferences, and I hope that members think that they're supporting a thoroughly worthwhile organisation. We have a London office. The BIAA manager is Claire McCafferty, who's sitting there in the middle of the room, and is ready to respond to any inquiries. And the website tells you what we're doing. We run lectures here in London, just like your own organisation. I listed the first one, not well conscious that it had already happened, but just to reassure you that the British Institute is not just confined to archaeology. The lecture at the end of last week from Bill Park was on a very topical question indeed, Turkey's relation with the Kurdish regional government of northern Iraq. Coming up on the 17th of December at the British Museum will be a showcase lecture at SOAS. I'm sorry.
No. At the Brunei Theatre.
At the Brunei Theatre in SOAS, so even closer to here, on the excavations at Boğazköy, and still to be confirmed, but we're sort of negotiating a lecture at the end of January, probably at the British Academy, on Turkey's relations with the Middle East. And I think there's a likelihood I may be lecturing again myself in May on a more academic, rather on my own territory, as it were, to the Institute as well. So we're trying to maintain a programme of 4 or 5 public lectures a year as a showcase for our activities. There's a number of leaflets and brochures on the side there, and I hope that if you are interested and don't know this is your first introduction or a relatively early introduction to the Institute's work, you'll pick up one of the brochures and perhaps think of joining if you're not a member already. We want to enlarge our membership, but we're also very anxious to establish good and active relations with all the other, as it were, Turkey-focused organisations in the UK on whose experience we can draw, and in the hope that they too can draw on something of our experience, because we're all smallish organisations, and I think if we can operate as a sort of a federation, we shall be more effective than if we're simply isolated, fighting our own little battles in our own corners. Thank you very much. I've gone on too long. It's 1933, so I'll stop.
Prepared to answer some questions.
Of course, yes, of course.
Anybody want?
I'd first of all like to say what a pleasure it has been for me, because many of the people you've talked about, people like Stephen Lloyd and Jimmy Mellart, and more recently Ian Hodder and Roger Matthews, do very well. I've taught at the Institute of Archaeology. But one really quite specific detail which I would like to ask about. Perhaps it's a rather specialised thing, but is there work on sort of dating, and particularly dendrochronology? Are there local sequences for Anatolia of the sort of, the victim things?
The dendrochronology, that for the non-specialists, this is the dating technique whereby you look at tree rings and you can assign a tree ring to a period, and you can build up these long sequences of tree rings, so it's a fantastically powerful chronological tool which potentially can give you very, very accurate dating. The king of dendrochronology in Turkey is a man called Peter Cunningham, who is now retired but was based in Cornell University in the United States. He collaborated a lot with the Institute, as he did with other excavators, because his job was to go around Turkey, find excavators who got samples of ancient wood, which he could then measure and analyze and then put into his database, and thereby with the objective of building up a complete sequence of tree ring dates from antiquity to today. The problem with the dendrochronological sequence in Turkey is that it works for the medieval period back to sort of late Byzantine Seljuk period. It works through the prehistoric period when we've got long sequences, but there's a big and significant gap from round about sort of 600 BC to 700 AD, when we haven't got a reliable link. So we haven't got the full, I mean, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I think the answer is we don't have a full sequence all the way through, which means that if you've got a wood sample from, say, Roman Ankara, something I know about, you can't actually, it floats because we haven't got a sequence going all the way through. So the Institute hasn't actually itself done a dendrochronological project. It's provided material for this master project of Peter Cunningham and colleagues.
Well, it was a very, very interesting talk, and I mean, what is, I think, very interesting and surprising to people like me is this inclination to move into different sort of studies in addition to archaeological studies. I think you mentioned religion and politics, for instance. I mean, there's a great gap at the moment in Ottoman Turkish studies in this country. So it's very welcome to see things moving in that direction. But it is a big jump for you, really, isn't it? And I just thought moving from archaeology into Ottoman history was probably the natural course, isn't it? And move forward from that, rather than move straight into modern things. But there's a progression from archaeology, I think, into Ottoman history. Religion is a huge topic, of course, and terribly, terribly difficult to work in with Ottoman government and so on. But that seems to me a progression, as it were, from archaeology. Does that need a bit of more discipline in a way that is going to happen, especially because there's so little development now in this country in Ottoman Turkish studies?
I mean, you remember the Institute is an institution, and as I say, the institution is obliged to change. It's being asked to change by the British Academy to serve the academic community in Britain, to serve British researchers collaborating with Turkish and other researchers. We're very international. I mean, not just British and Turkish, but there are a lot of other international collaborations going on as well. So, absolutely clearly, our inherited expertise is in archaeology. That's where, for 60 years, we have been doing that professionally. On the other hand, our membership is changing now. Our current assistant director is a contemporary Turkey specialist. He wrote a doctorate on electoral politics in Turkey. Our previous assistant director was a early medievalist Ottomanist in sort of Seljuk Ottoman period was his speciality. So we're using our assistant director position to broaden our contacts and our expertise. We're awarding research fellowships to currently one research fellow is a sort of social anthropologist, but looking very much at urban Islamic society in Turkey. So we're building up both in personnel terms, but also in terms of our library resources, the infrastructure that will make it possible for scholars or collaborators who want to use the institute, because it gives them access to contact to Turkish scholars, gives them access to material that's in Turkey, gives them an opportunity to get to know Turkey at first hand, which has always been a great strength of the institute, across a range of disciplines which we hitherto weren't serving at all. Insofar, I mean, in my view, I'm sure it's yours as well, that the study of Turkey needs to be developed a good deal more in this country than it is. There are relatively few universities that do Ottoman studies or contemporary Turkish studies in a serious way. They're usually quite isolated. I think the Institute potentially has an important part to play in establishing those sort of links and contacts and making it more of a dynamic subject in the UK. That's certainly what's expected of us. Whether we can deliver it is up to us to make the best of the contacts we can.
Yeah.
It was very interesting talk, thank you very much. I just wanted to know what was exactly the problem, the Çatalhöyük problem that Mallard had, because there was also a directorate gap of 2 years around that time.
Sorry, there was
They didn't have a director for 2 years, and according to the dates you showed us as well in the list of numbers.
Oh yes, no. The gap in the directorship followed. That's a different issue. That was 1993 to 1995, after David French stood down, and it took, I think, 18 months to 2 years before we were able to appoint Roger Matthews for various things. I won't go into details, but
he was acting director.
We had David Shanklin. We had an anthropologist actually who was an acting director in that time, and I should have put him in honoris causa, but I left him off. But he wasn't actually director. He was assistant director, acting as director for that time. But to go back to the other question. Well, this is the great skeleton in the Institute's cupboard.
Sorry.
I won't tell you the whole story because I didn't know it, but in broad outline, Mellart dug Çatalhöyük 61 to 64. It was a site that was gradually attracting more and more publicity and attention, so it was high-profile stuff. In the middle of it, the famous scandal of the Dorak treasure emerged, where Mellart was claimed and reported that he'd seen a sort of illegally excavated finds from prehistoric Anatolia, which he'd not properly been able to document, but published his own drawings, and the Turkish Ministry of Culture got very excited about this and said, this must be illegally excavated antiquities. Mellart is clearly complicit or implied, he can't have been up to any good, so that there was a lot of, very heavy pressure on Mellart, and he was, especially in the press at the time, was seen as a dangerous foreign archaeologist who was somehow aiding and abetting the smuggling of antiquities. I don't think there's any truth in that at all. There are plenty of other things that one might speculate about, but that seems deeply unlikely. But it meant that Mellart himself was then under suspicion. And that aggravated the attention on Çatalhöyük, and questions arose, especially about the wall paintings, which were being found in large numbers, were very difficult to conserve. And people said, well, you can't go on digging these things because they collapse, and they're just made of mud plaster. I mean, they're almost impossible to. And so Mellart was, he might have been unwise, but he was also very unlucky in the victim of both, as it were, popular and press-driven hostility and suspicions then among the authorities, and that meant that his permit was retracted. I mean, I think that, in a sort of nutshell, is what went on. I mean, there are books that have been written about it, journalistic articles, speculation, which I don't think, well, I'm not in a position to go any further on that. But it certainly was a bad outcome for the Institute at the time, not just because Melat was removed from working in Turkey, which was a shame for Turkish prehistory, because he was, as I say, a fantastic archaeologist and scholar. But it led to political tensions in the Institute itself, which became, people who were pro and anti-Melat, and all those sorts of things you can imagine happening in small organisations that generally don't do them any good.
The element you've left out, Stephen, is that Jimmy Melat was the most charmingly tactless man that God ever made. And he had, for instance, written rather bluntly to one of his sponsors about the shortcomings of the Turkish authorities in the archaeological field. And that letter got published. Not surprisingly, he wasn't very popular in official circles, quite apart from the Durack treasure business.
Yes. There was a sort of sublime innocence about a lot of what Melat seemed, the way he presented himself and talked about things that got him into no end of trouble.
I think we're running up against time, but can I just ask you, in the archaeological field in particular, and the Institute, for very good reasons, veers away from archaeology to some extent about the particular emphasis on survey rather than excavation. Isn't it just a question of money? I mean, archaeology is expensive and excavation is fiendishly expensive. It's rather a shame that there is so little excavation now, and the Institute, for instance, you didn't mention Inuanda, but the Institute failed to take on Inuanda with that wonderfully exciting stuff, the Diogenes inscription and all that.
Yes, I don't think it's just a question of money. I mean, that particular case, no, I managed to avoid mentioning Inuanda at all, but that was a site in the southwest where there would have been, rich pickings to be had, as it were, rich finds to be made, and the Institute wasn't able to follow up earlier work it had done there, and it's now being run as a German project. Yes, money. We give currently about £50,000 a year directly to 3 excavations. So that impressive list of about 12 or 14 projects I showed you a slide or two back, we weren't supporting all those with money. We'd have gone bust very quickly, I think through various logistic ways. We've never really had, through our public funds, enough money to be able to run more than 1 or at the most 2 substantial excavations at any one time. And going right back to the early days of the Institute, I mean, to Seton Lloyd, I think, probably financed most of Beja Sultan from his own money. Çatal Höyük ran on budgets from 1961 to 64 that would appear laughable these days. On the other hand, what we do is we try to give to our sort of flagship projects, which still include Çatal Höyük, the credibility to the directors to go and get funds from other big donors, either research funds or corporate funds. And so Çatal Höyük, for instance, we give a very modest sum of about £15,000 a year to support. I think in very flush years we might have managed 20,000, but normally we can't do that. And the director has to work his magic with his other sponsors and raise £500,000 a year And in that case, he's able to do it, A, because he's a very good director, and B, because the site is a very prominent and attractive site and therefore does attract sponsorship. I think just to keep the answer brief and also straight on the money question, when I started work in Turkey in the 1960s and 1970s, Turkey was a poor country, relatively, and spent hardly any money on its cultural heritage, on excavations or restoration of monuments or whatever. Now Turkey is a rich country by most standards, and it spends very, very significant sums on those things, so that the balance of investment into archaeology has changed. Now Turkey itself puts most of the work that goes on in Turkey is financed, and quite well financed, by Turkish sources, and the overseas input in financial terms is relatively quite small and getting smaller, so that it's mirroring, Turkey's own economic development is the way that it invests in its own culture. And that means that more and more of the archaeology in Turkey is done by Turkish archaeologists, obviously, and relatively less by overseas archaeologists.
I think
Last
your
one.
last comments there, you can almost put it in a percentage form, that 40 years ago was 1% of Turkey excavated, and now you've done a little bit more. It's just such an open book, isn't it, of sites that are sitting there, as you said earlier, with buildings to a high.
Well, I'm amazed. I mean, when I started as a researcher on Turkey, and I read the literature, and I'd know from some obscure footnote that in such and such a province, a discovery, a site had been identified and that it fitted somewhere into the picture. And now I find the place has been excavated, for heaven's sake. I mean, not just some obscure footnote, but it's been, there's a whole, volumes of reports on the thing. There's a huge expansion of work. Still an awful lot still to be done, though.
That's right. I mean, you start on a site, but there's much more at the site there. The Ephesus or Aphrodisias, there's still areas to cover.
Oh yes, the more people work on it, the slower it goes. The more detail there is to be found out.
And the more delay in publishing. I think we must stop that stage. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen.